Deaf education began in America in the early 1800s when Minister Thomas Gallaudet wanted to communicate with his little deaf neighbor, Alice Cogwell. Alice's father asked Thomas Gallaudet if he would consider finding a way to educate his daughter. This led Thomas Gallaudet onto a journey all the way to Europe, where he met deaf Frenchman Laurent Clerc and asked him to come back to America. Together, they established the first deaf school in Hartford, Connecticut, known as the American School for the Deaf, ASD. Since the American population was so spread out at this time, it became common practice for a deaf student to live at their school. They became residential schools. They would stay for the week or longer periods of time. This was often the first time a deaf student was exposed to any kind of signing. So it was a socializing place as well. Deaf adults and children, they would be interacting. And what emerged out of this is what we know today as American Sign Language, ASL. The education was very similar to their hearing peers. And by the 1900s, there was about 50 deaf schools established in America. Since most Americans were trade workers at this time, boys would learn different trades at school: printing or shoemaking or woodworking, tailoring. Girls would learn cooking and sewing. In the mid 1800s, several deaf schools were printing their own school newspaper, and they would exchange it with other deaf schools, and they became known as the Little Paper Family. It was a way to help build community and to keep people informed. In 1880, at the Milan Conference, a number of deaf educators from Europe and a few from America gathered together and they voted on what is the best way to educate deaf students. Unfortunately, oralism was the vast majority voted for, and so now sign language was banned from schools. Students were punished if they used any kind of sign. And really, this has had a drastic and a negative effect on the uh, educating of deaf students. At one point, there was 40% of the deaf educators were deaf themselves, and now it's really only about 13%. Alexander Graham Bell is infamous for supporting the oralist method of educating deaf students. And at this time, the National Association of the Deaf was established, and they had different presidents like George Videtz who really supported the use of signing for educating deaf students. There were no deaf schools for African American students before the Civil War. And then in 1869, North Carolina started its first color department on the same campus but separate from educating the white deaf students. The wonderful thing was after the Milan Conference, the black deaf schools did not ban signing. And so really they preserved ASL for us. And then all across America in 1954, schools became integrated. Deaf education has changed drastically in the last several decades. In 1975, the federal government passed a law having all students be taught in the least restricted environment possible, which meant that a lot of deaf students now were able to receive services at their local public schools, and many students now are educated in a mainstream setting. 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and so now there is legal rights for accessibility. Discrimination was banned. There have been lots of technological advancements. Hearing aids have changed, cochlear implants, um, and then in an effort to find different ways of communicating, different people have developed methods of communication used now in education settings such as cued speech or signed exact English, seen essential English. Currently, 80 to 85% of deaf students attend their local public mainstream school. There are also oral deaf schools where there is a focus on listening and speaking with no ASL. And then there are deaf schools where they are taught in a bilingual approach using ASL and in English. The bicultural aspect is they are immersed in the deaf culture at their school, and then they're able to go back home in their hearing environment and learn to balance between those two. According to the American School for the Deaf, there are 49 residential deaf schools and 47 deaf day schools in America?